In our next section, we're going to start to talk about what are some of the other recommended resources that you can use for preparation, and also what is an overall strategy that you want to apply as you're going through your studies, ultimately leading you towards the lab exam. Now, as I mentioned, me personally, I currently have 4 CCIEs and CCDE, so I would highly recommend to use the methodology that I'm talking about here because it is a tried and true method. Also true for Brian Dennis and the other instructors that do development and work for INE. The big thing here is, and not to take too much time on this, but it seems almost self-explanatory, but people very often overlook this, is that the ultimate goal of the CCIE certification is not really to pass the lab exam, it's to become an expert. If you become an expert in the technologies, you by default will pass the exam. Okay, you may not pass the exam on your first attempt. There's lots of other factors that go into the actual day of the exam. But long story short, if you become an expert in the technology, you will pass the lab. So your ultimate goal should not be to study for the lab per se. Your ultimate goal should be to build a very large foundational base of how the technologies work. So once you're to that point, and once you really are an expert in the technologies, you should be able to look at a topology just offhand and say, here are the potential design issues you're going to run into. This is how I would build this topology. These are the interactions that are going to happen between the technologies. Because if you really understand how they work behind the scenes, then you should not have any problems with the actual questions that they're going to be asking you the day of the exam. Now, the reason I even mention this, though, is that a lot of people don't take this approach. And a lot of people instead try to prepare for the exam just by going through labs after labs after labs. And the issue with this is that you probably could pass the exam ultimately doing this. But typically the candidates that we see that use this method are the ones that are taking the exam 8 times, 9 times, 10 times before passing it, because they're simply trying to learn how the configuration works and they don't really understand what's the big picture overall. So just keep this in the back of your mind as you're going through your preparation. If you get to a point where you really don't understand something, you need to make an honest you need to make an honest assessment of yourself and realize what do I know and what do I not know. And when you find yourself running into those situations where you don't really understand why something is working, then you need to fall back to the fundamentals. So go back to the recommended readings on the technology, go back to this video series as I'm explaining how the technologies work and then showing the examples of them, because ultimately it normally turns out that whatever technology you didn't prepare for is probably going to be the one that's on the exam. So if you don't really know how multicast works, don't cross your fingers and just say, I hope I don't get multicast in the exam. So not to spend too much time on this, but again, keep this in the back of your mind that you always want to make sure that you really understand at a fundamental level how all of these technologies work. Then ultimately when you get to the exam, it's not going to matter what questions they ask you. If you know how OSPF works, you know how OSPF works. And then you'll be able to do whatever implementation that they're asking. Now, specifically, the way that I would recommend to get there in order to become an expert in the technologies is that you need to follow an incremental approach. Okay, you can't immediately go and read the most advanced texts on MPLS Layer 2 VPNs and go through the implementation, because if you don't know what is MPLS and what is the problem that it's trying to solve, you're not really going to understand the overall big picture of it. So the way that I like to do this is a very straightforward 4-step approach. Okay, first and foremost, you need to get just a basic understanding of what's going on. Okay, so what is MPLS? Why would you even want to use it to begin with? Okay, then get a basic hands-on configuration experience. So how do I configure basic label distribution protocol? How do I configure basic BGP VPN-v4 peerings? How do VRFs work? Whatever the technology is, you're looking at just getting the most basic cursory understanding of how do you implement this to try to reinforce what you've learned up to this point. Now, once you get past these steps and you know the fundamentals of the technologies, then you can start looking at them at an expert level. So then go back to the recommended readings, go back to the video series, and you're trying to figure out from an expert level, how does this work in more advanced designs? And then ultimately, how do you implement this in more advanced designs? But the reason that this is so important is that so many people immediately try to jump to step 4, skip step 1, 2, and 3, and they don't realize it until another 2 years later when they've already failed the exam 4 times. So regardless of whatever the topic is, if you take this very structured approach, you'll find that it's going to save you a lot of time in the long run, and that ultimately you're going to be an expert in the technologies, which is what we're really trying to do. Because passing the exam is arbitrary. Ultimately, the goal of having this certification is that you can apply this stuff in the real world. So in terms of preparation resources, outside the scope, of course, of this class and outside the scope of our other materials like the lab workbooks, there's a lot of just general reading that you need to do in order to understand these technologies. And there's really going to be no shortcut for this. So you can't skip the readings and figure out and think that you're going to know how MPLS works, or skip the readings and know how BGP works. You need to always start with this. This, again, is that step 1, just getting a basic understanding. Okay, once you get beyond the basics, which most of the books are pretty good at covering the core technologies, but not really all of the advanced applications, this is where then you want to move into the documentation. So the documentation is going to show you specifically how does Cisco do the implementation. So this is where the config help is going to be. This is where you start to learn about the caveats of what is supported, what is not supported, both in terms of the technology and in terms of the products. So when we look at the documentation here, I'm going to show you 2 different portions. The first one, for the technology documentation, is something that you want to use during your preparation, but you won't have access to it in the actual exam. The product documentation is different. That's the actual iOS configuration guide and command reference. But the thing is, people overlook all the other information that's available in the documentation that is outside of that scope. So I'll talk about specifically what is available in the technology documentation. And this is all free information. This is just on Cisco's website. Now, in terms of recommended readings, and I say this every time I talk about this, I swear that I do not work for Safari Books Online. But I would highly recommend that you guys get a subscription to this. If you haven't seen the Safari Online website before, it's essentially the publisher of Cisco Press. This is their ebook site. So if you go to safari.o'reilly.com, or I think it goes to mysafaribooksonline.com, and if you look at just the price of getting a subscription here versus what any of these books cost in printed format, and it's really up to you whether you prefer to have physical books for reading. Personally, for me, I have tons of books on my physical bookshelf, and I don't think I picked up any of them in probably 5 years. I think the last time I picked them up was to move them from my old office to my new office. But the advantage of using Safari here is that you can search all of the content, not just the titles. So, for example, let's say we're trying to figure out something on OSPF virtual links. You could just type that in there, and then instead of trying to figure out what are all the different books that cover this, it's going to link you right to the individual sections that talk about that. So what this is going to be useful for, again, is not necessarily to learn the topics, because when you learn the topics, that's when you probably want to start at one end of the book and just read it all the way through. But when you're looking at something very specific, and maybe you're looking for a configuration example or information about how does this design work, this is ultimately what Safari is great for. That you can look at multiple authors' take on the topic, because sometimes you might read one person's book and you don't really like their explanation. You read it through somebody else and then it starts to click. Okay, usually in my experience, this is what helps me is to read about the technology from different authors' take on it, and then you slowly start to piece all the information together, and then you get a better overall picture of it. Now, there's without getting into too far of the details with this, there's basically 2 different subscriptions I think you can get. One of them is, and I'm not sure exactly where this is, that would be under like your account, but I think one of them you can say, I want 10 books and I'm going to have only these 10 books for this month. The other one is the full subscription, which I think is like $45 US. But the thing is, there's so many books on this list of what is recommended to go through that even if you spend 18 months preparing for the exam, it's going to be cheaper to do the Safari subscription than the printed books. So again, you know, I'm not a salesman for Safari, I swear. but it's a really good resource if you guys haven't seen it. So check it out. The other thing is that we like to separate the books into two different categories first. The vendor independent ones should be first, and then the vendor specific ones second. Okay, the reason why is that you don't want to learn the implementation before you understand why would you even do it to begin with. So for example, a perfect example is this last one on the list, the MPLS-enabled applications. Okay, this is a very general book that doesn't have anything to do with configurations, but it says, what was the market driver for MPLS to begin with? So why did we even need to invent this technology? Then what is the application of it? So what are the different designs that MPLS supports? What are the different ways to do layer 3 VPN versus layer 2 VPN, and why would you do it one way versus another? Once you know the basics that this talks about just from a technology point of view, then you could go on to the next step, which would be something like MPLS fundamentals or MPLS configuration on Cisco IOS, and look at the actual implementation that Cisco is doing. So again, it's not to say that the vendor-specific books are bad. It's just that you don't want to learn the implementation before you know why you would do that even to begin with. So this particular list, you can find it on under ine.com/resources, but I'll also post this along with the later links that I'm going to give. So you'll see the specific books that I'm talking about here. But the way that you generally would want to approach this is focus on just IP first. So if you've never read Internetworking with TCP/IP, or if you've never read TCP/IP Illustrated, then you're definitely selling yourself short, because nothing has changed in really the core operation of IP for the last 20 years. So if I'm learning about IP, or let's say I want to learn OSPF, it doesn't make sense to read any other book on OSPF except the one from the guy who wrote OSPF. So start with the vendor independent book first, which just says, this is the protocol, this is why I wrote it, this was the problem I'm trying to solve. Then move on to something like routing TCP/IP that says, this is how Cisco actually implements the protocol. So again, it's not any type of shortcut that you can go through. It is going to be time consuming to do this. And that's why I was talking about before, is that this is not a realistic goal to say, I'm going to pass my CCIE in 30 days. This has to be something that's saying, in 18 months from now, I'm going to be an expert at all these technologies. And then realistically plan out what your schedule is going to be. And then you need to be constantly renewing your assessment of yourself throughout the process to figure out, at this point, do I really understand how this technology works? Okay, if I'm comfortable with it, check it off the list and move on to the next one. But the thing is, if you try to shortcut this, you're going to end up in that inverted pyramid where you're trying to look at just the very top level of the implementations without really understanding why you would even do this to begin with. Now, beyond just the regular books, and again, there's a lot of these, so it is kind of overwhelming, but you just have to start at one end and slowly start to chip away with it. The other big thing is going to be the Cisco documentation. Now, technically, the documentation is the only resource that you would ever need for any Cisco technology. They have by far the best documentation that I've seen out of any vendor for anything. So the information is there. Every question that they ask you in the exam, the answer's in the documentation. The thing is just that most people don't know how to properly use the documentation. And when you look at how much information is there, it's just completely overwhelming to figure out, how do I even sort through this, or where would I even start? So that's what I want to talk about here briefly, is why would you use the technology documentation separate than the product ones, and how can you figure out, with just the vast scope of what they have on there, what's going to be actually useful for us to use. So let's go ahead and take a look at Cisco's website here. So from just cisco.com, where you want to go to is click on support, and then somewhere on this page, it should be somewhere towards the bottom, there should be a link that says configure. Now, when you're taking the actual lab exam and you open up your web browser, this is going to be the home page. Okay, this is the main documentation homepage that you're going to get to the configuration guide, the command reference, and then also the actual technology documentation. What I would recommend personally is to set this to be your home page. So then every time you open up your web browser and you're going to Facebook or you're going to Reddit, you think, I probably should be studying instead. But in seriousness, the reason why you need to be so familiar with this is that the search engine is disabled in the exam. So if you're going to use this at the time of the actual test, you need to already know where every document is located and specifically how do you get there. Okay, so like I mentioned, there's two different portions of the documentation. There's the product documentation and there's the technology documentation. So let's start under technology. Let's say technology IP and then something like IP routing protocols. IP routing OSPF. Okay, it should eventually redirect you to the correct page. And this is then going to be under the IP routing technology support. So from here, it's a little bit easier to navigate back and forth between the domains. But if you look at how this is formatted, it starts with just a generic Q&A. So what's like some overall information that I would need to use about or need to know about OSPF? Okay, these documents here, the frequently asked questions, you definitely want to read through these for all of the IGPs, for BGP, for MPLS, for multicast, for QoS, basically all the very high-level topic domains. Try to go through the technology domains and see if they have these Q&As. Okay, a lot of the stuff that's in here might be kind of self-explanatory, like what does route summarization mean? So hopefully at this point everyone knows what route summarization means. But some of these might not be as obvious. Like what's the difference between default gateway, default network, and the actual default route? Or what is unicast reverse path forwarding, and can a default route be used to perform a URPF check? So as the list goes down, it gets a little bit more specific as to what it's covering. But the thing is that it's just a really good central resource that you can use here in order to get just some general information about the protocols. Okay, the other thing is that you'll see that it will sometimes link directly to the RFCs. Okay, the RFCs themselves I'll talk about when we go through the particular technologies, where you don't necessarily have to read them, but the thing is, if you get to a point where you don't really understand why something is working or how something is supposed to work, then it might be time to actually read the specification, because it's going to clearly say this is what must be supported, this is what should be supported, and this is what's optional. And then from that, you can kind of infer why is it behaving like this. Like, for example, in OSPF, we'll look at how OSPF path selection works. Why would it choose an inter-area route over an intra-area route in certain designs? Well, it depends on the RFC. The RFC says you have to run path selection this way. So if you're confused about it, that might be the best resource in order to look back at. So you don't need to necessarily memorize the RFC numbers. They're not going to test you on that in the exam. But since most of these protocols are open standards anyways, it's a good idea to be familiar with that. So on these Q&A pages, you'll see sometimes it links directly to what the RFC numbers is. You'll also see the technology white papers. Anytime you find one of these, the design guide, you definitely want to read through that. Okay, a great example of this would be, for example, the DMVPN design guide. And it talks about why would you choose DMVPN over other solutions. So why would you use it over MPLS L3 VPN? Or why would you use it over Get VPN over private layer 2 transport? So again, the first thing about all these technologies is you want to figure out, just from a high-level marketing point of view, why might you use this? Okay, once you know the sales info of what is OSPF, why am I trying to sell it to you, then you can get into the nitty-gritty details of how does OSPF do path selection over virtual links different than inter-area routes. So that type of stuff is going to be your final step when you're learning the expert level information. Yeah, you'll also see that as you start to go down this list, they get more detailed and they start to talk about specific examples. So beyond just the design guides, now they start to get into very specific things, like specifically how does the Type 7 to Type 5 link state conversion work? Okay, most people don't know that there's actually only one area border router that does the conversion, and there's a difference between what the forwarding address is in the translated route and actually how you send the traffic. So this will be one of the details I'll talk about when we get to OSPF, but you can end up in some unpredictable results, like I give you the route, but then you send your traffic a different direction. And if you didn't know these details at the expert level, this is the type of stuff that they're ultimately going to be testing on in the exam, is the expert level understanding. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these, through all the technologies, but do spend some time to go through them, where again, where you get to these is from the main documentation page. You go down to technology, then whatever your technology is, let's say, for example, security and VPN. And VPN would be like IPsec, IKE negotiation, and design guides, DMVPN design guide. But again, the thing is that if you don't know the manual navigation of this, if you never really click around, then you're not going to know that that stuff is available, and then it's here. But again, the big thing about this is that it's not accessible during the lab. So it's a great resource to use now, but you can't use it at the actual exam time. Now, what you can use during the actual exam time is the product documentation. So the product documentation is going to be the configuration guides, the command reference, and then the master index in the release notes. So there's mainly two different documentations that we need to go to within the scope of RSV5, which is going to be under products, we need to go to iOS, and then under switches, we need to go to the LAN access switches. Now, the platform doesn't really matter which you choose here, because again, the exam's not testing hardware-specific stuff, it's testing on just the software features. But again, the big thing is that the search is not available in the exam. So you have to learn the manual navigation paths, and most of these are not self-explanatory. A lot of times it doesn't make sense why a particular document is in one section versus another. So let's say, for example, you're trying to figure out how do BGP regular expressions work. Okay, if you don't know what a BGP regular expression is yet, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in the BGP section. But let's say you go to the Cisco documentation, and we go to products iOS. We go to regular iOS, 15M&T, 15.3M&T, and 15.3.3M. Okay, again, it doesn't really matter which release you pick. It should just redirect you to a page that you ultimately get to here, where it says documentation. And there's going to be mainly three different portions we're going to go to: the configuration guides, the command reference, and then the master index. So I'm going to come back to in more detail here, specifically what are the differences. But let's say, for that example I said, which is BGP regular expressions, this would be under the configuration guide, and this is going to be under terminal services configuration, the terminal service appendix for regular expressions. So it's like, how could you possibly know this unless you already knew it to begin with? And that's one of the big problems with the documentation, is that it's not self-explanatory where some of these things are located. So as I go through the different examples, through the different technology domains, I'll show step by step where the documents are located, but it's up to you to really spend the time when you're going through the labs, when you're watching the videos, that you should be going through the documentation navigation. So I know this is exactly where network address translation is. This is exactly where DMVPN configuration example is. Because in the lab exam, one of the big enemies is the time. That if you had 20 hours to do the exam, you might be able to solve it, but in 8 hours, you need to have a very structured strategy and a very structured approach. So if you waste a half an hour browsing around the doc CD, you're probably going to end up not having a good day. Okay, so specifically, the reason that you need to use the differences between them, the config guide versus the command reference and then the master index, really depends on what exactly you're trying to accomplish. Now, the configuration guide is when you're trying to figure out what's a step-by-step list of exactly what I need to do in order to implement a technology. And you'll see that all of the configuration guides follow the same type of general format, where they say this is what OSPF is, these are the caveats of the release. So in this release, maybe these are the open bugs or these are the closed bugs. And then these are the features we support, and then this is actually how to configure it. So step 1, go to config T. Step 2, say router OSPF. But the thing is, no matter what the topic is, they all follow the same type of general format. So you can always know, if I don't know how to do this offhand, just go to the task list and it'll tell me exactly what I need to do in order to do a particular implementation. And so let's say, for example, like doing network address translation. Okay, if you don't know the exact syntax, but you have a general idea of where that might be located, then you're probably going to be ahead of the game to start. Okay, so let's say we go to the configuration guides, and we would already have to know, again, where specifically in the documents it's located. Okay, NAT would be under IP, and it's going to be under IP addressing configuration. So IP addressing, network address translation configuration guide, configuring NAT for IP address conservation, and then you can see it has general information like how NAT works, why would you want to use it, okay, what are the different types of it, and then somewhere in the document in the middle it should say how to configure X, whatever the technology is. So if you go to this portion, then it gives you the step-by-step task list of what is specifically required and what is optional. So then you could just go down their list, and like we can see here, it says, you say IPNet inside source, and then you specify, am I doing a static translation, am I doing dynamic, and so on and so forth. Okay, also towards the end of the document, it should give you full config snippets, where if we look at configuration examples, let's say doing dynamic translation of inside source addresses. This would be one of the more common configs. So it says you create a pool. This is going to be what we're translating towards. You say what's the source addresses, so this is where the traffic is coming from. As it moves from the inside interface to the outside interface, if it is matched in access list 1, then translate it to pool 208. So again, even if you didn't know how the syntax works, you can pretty much look at their examples, change stuff around, and then come out with at least a minimal functional configuration. And you'll see that in the exam, these type of peripheral technologies, they don't really expect you to be an expert in SNMP or an expert in EEM. As long as you can do a basic functional config by using the documentation, usually that's what they're testing in those particular types of examples. Now, on the other hand, core topics you will need to know offhand, like BGP, how the path selection works, or how do you establish OSPF adjacency over DMVPN and different types of phase designs. So those type of things you probably would not want to use the documentation for in the exam, but you will want to use it in your regular preparation. Okay, like I said before, a perfect example of this would be if you're trying to figure out what's the config template for DMVPN. So from the main configuration guides, we would go down to security, secure connectivity, dynamic multipoint VPN, and then if we just skip to, actually in the first one, dynamic multipoint VPN, and then skip to just the configuration example, you can basically just take this full example, copy it into Notepad, change around the addresses, and then you have a fully functional config for DMVPN. So again, there's nothing wrong with relying on the documentation as long as you already know where you're trying to go. And that's the big thing that you need to spend time now while you're studying for the exam is, do I know where IPv6 automatic 6-to-4 tunneling is documented if I needed to look at that particular syntax? So try not to memorize all sorts of random nuances of the syntax. Rely on the documentation. It's going to help you to learn not only the syntax, but also where the particular topics are located. Now, the other use case is going to be the command reference, which just gives you the syntax trade-off. This is going to be when you know what you're trying to do, but you don't know what the exact syntax is, or maybe you don't know what the exact arguments or what the defaults are. So let's say they ask you a question that you want to configure the EIGRP hello timers to be 3 times the default. Well, I don't know what the default timer is. That's not something I want to memorize. I'm just going to go to the command reference, look at the command, and it's going to tell me what the default is. But again, the thing is you need to know where that's already located. So if we were to go to the command reference would be under the release, under reference guides, the command reference, and you see it's broken down into these multiple topics just like it is in the other sections. Okay, in the case of routing, this would be IP routing, EIGRP command reference, and then this is going to be the IP hello interval for EIGRP. Okay, it says configure the hello interval, use this command, and it says that the defaults are 60 seconds for low-speed NBMA, and then somewhere else in here it should say what the other default is. I think it's 10 seconds. But again, the key point being, here it is, 5 seconds for the other ones. The key point is that these are the details you don't want to memorize because you have access to the command reference. You already know how to find the command. How long did that take me? Okay, I was talking to you guys while I was doing it, but if I was fully concentrating, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and then that's just some other minute detail that you don't need to have to worry about. Okay, also, when you're reading through the command reference here, this is a great way that you can figure out what are features that I don't know in the particular topic. Okay, and that was part of the CCIE Tectorial that Bruno, the CCIE RNS program manager, was talking about. That when he was preparing for the exam, his number one thing to think about is I need to know what I don't know. Is to figure out, what is really the overall scope of everything that I'm trying to get to, and figure out this is what I'm comfortable with, this is what I'm not, and the stuff that I don't know, that's what I need to focus on. But the issue here is that there's no shortcut for this. You wouldn't know, for example, if you went to the OSPF command reference, and let's just pick any random section here. Let's say IP OSPF fast reroute, and let's say something like IP OSPF prefix suppression. Okay, this says to prevent OSPF from advertising all prefixes that belong to a specific interface, except for prefixes that are associated with the secondary IP addresses. To remove the per interface command, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what's the usage of this? It says you can suppress prefixes on a per interface basis for all interface types by entering this command. You can do it globally, you can do it per interface. When you enter the command, a prefix is generated for any interface type, then it is suppressed. But what's the real usage of this? Okay, why would you want to do this in a real design? And this is what the issue is, that if you didn't know that OSPF could do this, in the exam they might ask you a question talking about the end result, and you don't know that this is the command that they're talking about. Okay, specifically what the use case of this is for a large MPLS core, or it could be used in enterprise environments as well, but the basic logic is something like this, is that when I'm doing label switching, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we actually get to that section, but let's say that we have a basic MPLS layer 3 VPN where router 7 is the PE and router 5 is the PE, and then we have the customer routers 9 and 8 that we're trying to get traffic between. Okay, so we're trying to route traffic in, it comes in as IP, and we're trying to MPLS encapsulate it, and then send it through the MPLS core. Now, for any traffic that is transiting the service provider network, the only thing that it needs to know is what is the egress PE that you're trying to reach. Or in other words, the MPLS network would need to know specifically in this case, what are the routes to router 7's loopback and router 5's loopback, and what are the labels associated with it. But they don't need to know the details of the transit path. So for example, they would not need to know the route between router 1 and router 3, the actual address of the link, or even the link between router 6 and router 7. And the reason why is that we're never sending traffic to the link, we're always sending traffic past the link. We're just using it as transit. So what this command's actual usage is for scaling the MPLS core, that you can pull out the number of prefixes that you need in the routing table, which also means you reduce the number of labels that you need in the label forwarding base, and it starts to scale the IGP. But again, the issue is that you have to think about how could they ask me a question that is related to this. If I said to you, configure OSPF to scale the core by not advertising transit prefixes. Okay, if you've never even heard about this feature, you're completely lost. There's no way that you would have enough time in the exam in order to sort through the config guides or the command reference to try to figure out what they're talking about. And that's one of the big battles that using the documentation will fix for you, is that you need to know what you don't know. You need to figure out what are all the features of OSPF that are relevant to me. And I don't need to memorize the syntax, I just need to know that the protocol can do this. I just need to know that OSPF supports TTL security, just like BGP does. I don't need to know the syntax, it's going to be straightforward, it's going to be whatever it says here. But if I didn't know that you could do this, then that's what is going to be a big issue. So again, there's really no shortcut for this. I would highly recommend that you go through the documentation for all of the core protocols, which is going to be all of the IGPs, so RIP, OSPF, EIGRP. IS to IS, again, we don't need to know the implementation of. We just need to know the theory behind it. So it would be RIP, OSPF version 2 and 3, EIGRP version 4 and 6, and BGP. And then you need to know what are all the features that it supports. Again, not that you know the syntax offhand, but just that it can do this, and you can always refer back to the documentation. Now, there is one other problem that you can run into here, though, is what if you don't know where it's located? Okay, and somebody had a good question here I forgot to mention. You can do Control F, so you can search on the page, but you can't use the search engine. So the issue you can run into is, what if I'm trying to find network address translation, but I can't remember where exactly it's located? There's basically a reverse search that we can do by using the master index. Okay, the master index is basically an alphabetical list of all of the possible commands. So what you can do with this is, from the main documentation page, we would go to, so once we get to the release, we would go to the release and general information. No, there's not a master index here. Let's see. There's a master index in, I think I either need to go up a release or down a release, because it's not the same for each of these. Let's try 15OM. Someone said you have to use 15.2. Let me try 15.2. And this is one of the other big battles. I swear that it's somebody's full-time job at Cisco to move these links around on the documentation page. I think it's some kind of like mental warfare they're doing against the CCIE program. Either that, or these guys just need to justify what their job is in the web team. But you'll see that when you think you found where something is, and then you check the next day and it's completely gone. Okay, so let's say under iOS, we'll go to 15.2, 15.2T. And in documentation, master index. And master index. Okay, so this is where we're trying to get to. However you get there is going to be secondary towards it. So we're at the master index. So now it has the full list of all of the commands. Okay, I don't know exactly where NAT is located, but I do know some basic information. I know that it probably starts with the keywords IPNAT. So from here in the master index, I'm going to go to that section that says, it would be here, I believe. And on this page, I'm just going to do a search, so Control F, and say IPNAT, and you can see it finds the commands. Okay, next to this, it shows you what is the documentation section. And before you get to the exam, you will be familiar enough that you know what these shortcuts mean. This means IP addressing, IAD. If you click on this, this is going to redirect you to IP addressing services, and it's going to take you to the section specifically that has the NAT commands. But what else did this tell us here? Okay, maybe I'm not trying to find the commands for NAT, maybe I'm trying to find the configuration examples. But now, since we worked backwards and we landed at the IP addressing services command reference, we now also know that NAT is in the IP addressing service configuration guide. So then you could go to the config guide, do some random clicking around there, and then ultimately find the particular section that you're looking for. So I can't stress this enough. Try not to use your regular search engine, Google or Bing, whatever, in order to find these documents, because you can find them obviously by typing the whole name in. If you say like IPNAT command reference, and it's probably going to take you right to whatever that particular hit is, right to where we were before, but that doesn't really save you any time in the long run, because when you get to the exam, you can't do this. So again, make sure that you know how to use all three of these: the config guide, the command reference, and the master index. The master index mainly because you want to use to be able to do a reverse search and then the config guide to find the config examples, and command reference to find the syntax examples. Now, the Catalyst iOS documentation is going to be pretty much the same. They have the config guides, they have the command reference, and you'll also see that all of these guides are also available in PDF format. This is true both for iOS and for Catalyst iOS. This is great if you're trying to read through the documents end to end, like you want to put it on your iPad or your Android tablet. It's a little bit better formatted than the regular web documentation is if you're trying to spend a long time reading it. So, for example, like in Data Center, which was the last lab that I took, what I did before I started my preparation was to do this. I went to the DocCD site, and I went to the relevant platforms. In this case, that would be Products, Data Center, or actually under Switches. Switches, and then Switches and Data Center, next to 7K, any of these. And then the configuration guides. And I thought about what are going to be any of the relevant guides that I need to know, like let's say basic layer 2 switching, and then just download the full PDF. So this is where I started with just taking all the config guides and downloading them all to a single folder, and then I did a Dropbox sync to my iPad and my other, my phone and my other, whatever the other readers are. So anytime I want to do the reading, I know already where those documents are located, and you can open them all up. So in our particular case for RSV5, this is going to be the core layer 3 documents that you would want to look at. So specifically, it would be under configuration guides. It is going to be things such as first hop redundancy protocols. This would be where HSRP, VRRP, and GLBP is documented. IP addressing, that's things like network address translation. On application services, both of these together, these are kind of miscellaneous features. Like this is where DHCP server, DNS server would be listed. Next hop resolution protocol, this is part of DMVPN, but normally you don't really need this separately on its own. The other big ones, of course, are going to be routing. So each of the routing domains has its own separate configuration guide. So one for BGP, EHRP, OSPF, and RIP. Okay, make sure you also read through the protocol independent documentation. This talks about stuff that applies to all of them. So for example, policy-based routing. This is not necessarily specific to any dynamic routing protocol, but you need to know how PBR works. Okay, or basic IP routing. Okay, this is the type of stuff that you might think you know, but then you read through the details and you're like, hey, I didn't know I could do load balancing by doing multiple static routes and then by weighting them to multiple next hops out the same interface. So you could do something like, say, I want to do a 3-to-2 split on my traffic. And the way I do that is by pointing 3 default routes this way, 2 default routes that way, and then Ceph does load balancing unequally on them. But again, a lot of these things you wouldn't necessarily think about it until you actually read through the documentation and realize that you actually can do that with the feature. Beyond IP routing, then LAN switching, this is not the same as Catalyst LAN switching. This is if you have an Ether switch module in the router. So don't use this documentation. That's not the one you want for switching. The other one would be MPLS. Okay, inside MPLS, there's a lot of stuff that's outside of our scope for RNS. In MPLS, you would want to focus just on this one here, L3 VPN configuration guide, and then also on LDP configuration guide. So MPLS TE is not going to be in our scope. L3 VPN inter-AS carrier supporting carrier or MPLS L2 VPN, that stuff's outside of our scope. So just the basics and then the basic L3 VPN, which is that one there, and then the basic LDP. Then going back or going beyond this, QoS. Okay, so QoS definitely you want to know. There's a good generic overview document here, which I believe is under, let's see, these are all separate documents now. So I'm wondering if it's under the MQC. No, it's not that one. HQF. When we get to QoS, I'll have to look through this to see what document I'm looking for. There's a generic one that just talks about, maybe it's this one, Condition Management Overview. Yes, it's this document. So this talks about what are the different QoS techniques. So when would you use FIFO versus weighted fair queuing? When do you use random detection versus doing tail drop? When do you do policing versus shaping? And that's just this general congestion management overview document. There's a question here, isn't VPLS, Virtual Private LAN Services, in the scope now? It's only in the scope for the written exam, not for the lab exam. So you probably wouldn't need to go to the configuration guide. If you want to learn about VPLS, your best bet is to look at the VPLS design guide, because you want to know just the very high-level overviews, not the detailed information. So it would be something like this: implementing virtual private LAN services, or even if you look at the Juniper documentation or the other vendors, because VPLS is an open standard, but you want to read just basically the marketing info. So the white papers would be good for this, because it just says, this is the use case. So why would you buy VPLS? And then what are the different features that it supports? Okay, this is what the config looks like. But basically, you're trying to figure out, what's the design of it, not really what's the actual implementation. Okay, so beyond QoS, then we would have. Now we get into some of the more obscure stuff. Like after QoS, we have security, of course. So security under secure connectivity. This is where DMVPN and also IPsec would be located. So DMVPN configuration, and then IKE version 1, and then the IPsec data plane. This I'll come back to when we get to those sections, of course, and then talk about specifically what do you need inside of them. Multicast is another one. I think I skipped multicast, which is above routing. Okay, multicast is in here. In the case of multicast, you probably need just the most basic one, which is not going to be MVPN or MFib. It's probably just under PIM configuration, and then IP multicast overview and configuring basic multicast. We'll talk about some of these more detailed options later, like how, like for example, how bidirectional PIM works, what would be the use case for that, or how like Anycast RP works, or how source-specific multicast works. But within this scope, if you're familiar with just what's under here under basic multicast routing, this is probably 90% of the scope for multicast. Okay, after QoS, then, like I said, this is where the VPN stuff is documented, both for DMVPN and IPsec. Securing the data plane, this would be stuff like using ACLs. So unicast reverse path forwarding, access control lists. But a bunch of this stuff, again, is now outside of our scope. So I would not worry about content-based access control, and I wouldn't worry about iOS IPS, or also zone-based policy firewall. These three on their own, these are three huge topic domains, but again, they're outside of our scope now. Then securing user services, I think most of this is probably outside of our scope now too. Actually, I think all of that is outside of our scope. Then system management, this is where there's going to be a lot of basic stuff here that you maybe didn't know was even available to do. Like you could create a menu on the router to do automation, or you could do scripting with EEM or with TCL. That's the type of stuff that's going to be under system management. So configuration fundamentals, definitely read through this one. That's going to do, just basic stuff like how does auto install work? Or how do you set up the banners on the router? Okay, something like this, you could probably read through this whole thing in a weekend and then never have to come back to it. Then we have, there's, I believe, one more important other one here, which would be WAN. Under WAN, there's a very limited scope that, and actually, no, it's not even under there anymore. Where is it? It would be under, I'm looking for media independent PPP. I'm not 100% sure where that moved to. That might still be under legacy dial. Broadband aggregation, it might be under broadband aggregation. Broadband aggregation would be PPPoE, but there's still a separate section for PPP. So you'll see that also with the new topology that we're using, it has Ethernet only in the CSR 1000V. Technically, serial links are still within the scope of the exam, but it's a very, very small scope. So you can do this in GNS3 or you could do this on hardware boxes. It's basically only 2 commands. You say clock write and no shutdown, congratulations, you implemented serial. The stuff that is specific to PPP though, you can run this over Ethernet. So we will talk about things like PPP authentication, PPP multi-link, PPP LFI when we're dealing with QoS, but that stuff is independent of the underlying encapsulation because PPP is a protocol independent encapsulations, media independent. So again, like I mentioned, I'm going to get into this in more detail, and it seems like I got into a lot of detail now, but I'm honestly only scratching the surface of what is inside these documents. So once we go through the actual sections, like in OSPF, that's where I'll go through the OSPF documentation, BGP and BGP, and so on and so forth. Someone asks here, are the workbooks not complete enough? That's not really the issue, whether the workbooks have the topics covered. The issue is that in the exam, you're not going to have access to my workbook to look at the config examples. So you need to know specifically where the documents are if you need to use them as a reference. Okay, so don't call me during lunch and throw them in the bathroom or anything. I can't help you at that point. There's a question, if I understood correctly, if I book a rack and I go to router 1 and do show CDP neighbors, will I see all the other 19 routers? Actually, you won't. The reason why is that CDP is off on these routers by default. If you turn it on, you will though. So you need to say first in global config, CDP run, and then on the link level, CDP enable. But if you do this, and let me just quickly do this on all of these at the same time. CDP run, CDP enable, and then show CDP neighbors, show CDP neighbors. They'll see all of each other. So you can see here that they look like they're connected, all on the same link. It's just that they're all plugged into the vSwitch. So the vSwitch on the back end is what's connecting all of the ports. They're on the same layer 2 network. But then, again, when you actually go to configure the logical network, like here on this particular box, if we show IP interface brief, it has multiple logical subinterfaces. So this is a segment between routers 1, 2, and 4. And this is a segment between router 10 and 3. So just by doing different .1q tags, this is what ultimately builds the topology. There's another question here. When it comes to building the lab, can I write up a blog or on the forum? There actually is already a document under the workbook. So if you go to the member site, under workbooks, under RSV5, and then under the hardware topology, this one here, this talks about how you can build the network. So I go into details about what platforms you can use, both physical and virtual, and then what particular versions that you would want to use. Like if you want a physical terminal server, these are the different modules you can use, and so on. So again, this is under the workbook. It's under INE CCIE RNS V5 hardware topology. Okay, there's another question. Will the V5 exam consist of 40 to 50 devices? Basically, yes, but not all at once. So you'll have maybe 20 virtual routers in the troubleshooting section, maybe another 20 virtual routers in the config section, and then there are their unrelated topologies. So I don't think you're going to get a full network of 100 routers all at once, but throughout the course of the day, there will be a large number of devices that you're interacting with. There was another question here on the documentation. I didn't show the Catalyst documentation. Let me go through that real quick here. That would be under, so I'm going to clean this up a little bit. From the main documentation site, you would go to Products, Switches, which is here, Switches, Then we want LAN access switches, campus LAN access. And let's say, for example, 3560X. And any of these, doesn't matter what it is. Let's say that one. Then documentation, configuration guides. And let's say 1502SE. Then you'll see the Catalyst documentation is basically one large page. So anything in all configuration guides, you would find it under here. So this is what I meant about the PDF. If you download the PDF for Catalyst, it's one config guide for everything. But in the case of the iOS documentation, it's one PDF per topic domain, like one for OSPF, one for BGP. So specifically here, where you would find things that we would need to, LACP should be under channeling, which should be under, where? Configuring ether channels and link state tracking. It should be here. So LACP. So there's not as many topic domains you need to know in Catalyst, simply because the scope of Catalyst is just not that big compared to the routers. So the important ones would be things like configuring VLANs, configuring VTP, configuring private VLANs, and then let's see, spanning tree, multiple spanning tree, optional spanning tree features. I would say rep probably is not going to be in the scope. Same with flex links, that was removed. DHCP features and IP source guard, that's our L2 security. So that would be within our scope. IGMP snooping and multicast VLAN registration, that's for layer 2 multicast. Port-based traffic control, this would be stuff like port security, storm control, private VLANs, or actually not private VLANs, this is under its own section. Configuring LLDP, that's an open standard version of CDP. Configuring span and remote span. Unidirectional link detection. Network security with ACLs, this would be like VLAN ACLs. And then Ether channel. So there is still a lot of documentation you need to go through under here, but anything that overlaps with iOS, you don't need to reference both of them. Like for example, here we have configuring IP multicast routing. There's not really going to be a difference between this in Catalyst versus regular iOS. So Catalyst might not support all of the features, but if you just read the iOS documentation, you don't necessarily need to read the Catalyst one. So you want to focus on features that are specific to layer 2 switching, like VLANs, trunking, VTP, that type of stuff. Okay, there's a question. During the design of real switches connecting to the virtual server and allowing the VLANs to pass on the link, we might face an issue when we configure VTP pruning. My ultimate goal doesn't propose topology might affect some technology operations. That actually could be a case. I'll talk about that when we get into VTP pruning. The issue you're describing won't actually happen though, unless you do something that you're not supposed to, which would be to set the link towards the hypervisor as a spanning tree trunk edge port. But I'll come back to that and talk about it. It could be a potential issue. What the question is being asked is basically that if we look at the physical topology, so let me pull up my physical topology diagram, which is this one. The question is, what happens if you configure VTP pruning and then the switches accidentally prune a VLAN from this link that goes to the hypervisor? So it is a potential issue. You just need to make sure that whatever this link is, it's allowing all VLANs on the trunk. So don't edit the allowed list, don't do pruning on that link, and then you should be fine.